Welcome to Kevin Makes Cool Things. I'm Kevin, and this dagger is from Full Clearing Another World under a goddess with 0 believers. After finishing the first volume of the light novel, I decided to make this dagger for 3 reasons. First, I like the series. At this point, I've read the first 3 volumes of the light novel, and it does an interesting job exploring clever ways to use magic in combat. That's often ignored in other series, and it's satisfying to follow an imaginative main character. Second, the dagger itself has a unique design. There are a number of series I love, but they don't have any objects which are good candidates for 3D printing. For instance, I really enjoy Grimgar of Fantasy and Ash, but the only recognizable object I could make from that series was the trainee tag. Sure, there are weapons which the characters use and I could have modeled, but they weren't distinctive enough to be recognizable. It's not worth carefully replicating an item when it just comes out looking like a generic object. Third, no one had done this before. I like creating something new, so I generally try to go for items which haven't been modeled yet. When I do make something which has already been modeled by someone else, like the solo leveling daggers, I generally try to do my own interpretation, so there's more variety available for fans. Once I decided to make this, I started with a reference image. One thing that I didn't realize until I was making this video was that I actually made a mistake on the design. This part is actually supposed to be empty. This is pretty obvious in some of the other illustrations, but it wasn't clear in the one that I was using as a reference. I thought this section was just a piece of the blade with some shadowing. Without color, I didn't realize that I was looking at the character's skin and clothing through this hole in the dagger. These kinds of things happen on occasion, and I still think it's a neat project that's very recognizable, but I might make an improved version in future. I based the designs off of this illustration from Volume 1, which has a good view of the entire blade. I adjusted this in GIMP and then traced over the key details, so I could more easily work off of this in Blender. For the details on the pommel, I used this image from chapter 2 of the manga as a reference. Some of the art makes it look like this piece is twisted, but it's not consistent, so I went with the spheres. It's easier this way, and it's recognizable with either design. Modeling the blade was pretty easy. I wish there was more to it, but it's the same process as my last few daggers. I used a plane to trace the key details, then extruded that plane by 1mm. From there, I extruded it again and adjusted the top set of points so that the blade angled. This creates a flat edge to the blade, which is much easier to print and finish. A subdivision surface modifier and some well-placed creases makes this look awesome. It sounds really complicated, but shockingly easy after you've been through it a few times. Afterwards, I just had to mirror every piece, and it created the perfect blade. I made the handle and the hilt in the exact same way. Those were a little more complicated because they had to round nicely, but it was a similar approach with a few other adjustments. The details on the pommel are just spheres which I added and scaled a little bit. The really annoying parts of this were the raised portions. These needed to be thick enough that my printer could handle them and do a good job defining them, without being so thick that they didn't look like they belonged on a knife. It came together pretty quickly, and after about 2 hours, I was ready to divide this up. It was at this stage that I realized I had scaled some of this incorrectly. I spent the next 4 hours handling a 1mm size difference. I ended up exporting and printing this in 2 different ways. My first attempt was divided up into 7 pieces. I printed the blade in 3 pieces with holes in between them so I could add bits of nail to help align these during gluing. I printed the raised portions as separate pieces, with 1 for each side of the handle and 1 for each side of the blade. This was almost clever on my part. The issue I always face is how to sand recessed details where my tools won't reach. It sucks when your prop looks great, but the cracks and crevices have horrible layer lines. I thought that by printing the raised pieces separately, I could break up most of the recessed details, meaning there would be almost no place I couldn't reach with my sandpaper. Then I would glue everything together at the end, and it would look perfect. I exported these files back in February, right as my 3D printer started having issues. In April, I finally got my 3D printer working again, and the first thing I printed were the remaining pieces of this dagger. I actually wasn't sure if I was going to be able to finish the Kamish daggers in time, so this was my backup plan. I know I don't make any money off of this channel, and there's not too many people watching, but it does make me really happy to post every month, and I want to keep up that streak. Pretty quickly I ran into issues with pieces not lining up properly. The raised portions of the handle were too long. I could have modified the files and tried reprinting them, but I wasn't sure if I was going to have time. I tried shaving down these pieces, which went alright. After doing a round of finishing on the pieces, I moved on to gluing them together with two-part epoxy, which did not go great. My clamp setup is lacking in both quantity and quality, so there were some significant gaps which I needed to use wood filler on. At this point, I was getting really annoyed with this area, which didn't print nicely, and I couldn't effectively sand because my tools wouldn't fit in there. It was around this time that I was fiddling with my 3D printer and discovered something. My printer has always had trouble with layer lines, but when I was tinkering with it, I discovered that was much less of an issue when I wasn't printing multiple parts. I decided to reprint the Dagger and divided it into 6 pieces. I did this by dividing it down the middle and then into 3 chunks from there. Then I printed each piece with the details facing up, so the printer could better handle the details, and it worked so much better. I did have some trouble during gluing. Some of these pieces didn't line up perfectly, and one of the thinner pieces had bent a little bit when I was taking it off the printer bed. It still went together alright, it just meant there was a little more sanding to do. I started off the sanding process by doing a rough pass with my Dremel tool. Then I applied some wood filler and hand sanded everything. Then I sprayed this with some primer, which is normally where I stop, but I decided to go back and do another round of wood filler. The solo leveling daggers were all about learning Blender. My focus was on the designs, and I was just finishing them as best I could, especially given that I was trying to post one per month. Now that I know Blender, at least well enough to do props like this, I want to put more emphasis on finishing projects nicely. Improving the quality of my prints is one thing, but doing a better job with the wood filler, sanding, and priming is also important. After the second round of wood filler and priming, this was looking much better. There were still some minor issues, but I knew paint would cover most of that. I cleaned up some of the last few rough areas with a knife and some sandpaper before moving on to painting. At this point, I had the startling realization that I didn't know what color this was. In my head, I was assuming that the blade was silver, the detailing was blue, and the hilt was gold. But this isn't ever shown in color in the first 3 volumes of the light novel. I looked through the future illustrations for a colored picture of this and saw an unfortunate number of spoilers. It's always a risk when you're doing this kind of thing, but it still stings. I'm going to show you cropped images of all of this, so there shouldn't be any spoilers for you. In volumes 6 and 7, the illustrations show the blade in color. They're both consistent with each other, but there are some issues. They show the edges of the handle as being gold, this raised portion as being almost the same color as the blade, and this piece as being completely empty. As I mentioned earlier, this is actually consistent with Volume 1, I just didn't realize it at the time. Still, I didn't like the colors they chose. I decided to base the colors off of the cover of the manga, which I think looks much better. I decided to paint the blade and the handle a light blue, with the raised portions being a darker blue. I'm going to paint the hilt gold, and I'm going to paint each of the spheres on the bottom a different color. After looking at this picture, I decided to sequence them as gold, dark blue, and then light blue. I started with the light blue paint because it's easy to paint over. This is actually the same paint color I used on Baruka's Dagger. I like it because it's the perfect balance of blue and white. In artwork, it's easy to use these delicate shades, but that's harder to pull off on actual props. I lean towards more exaggerated colors on props because I don't want them to come out looking too bland. I'm being really careful with this painting. I have a bad habit of applying heavy coats of paint to speed up the process. I'm trying to do better, so I'm going for a really light coat on this. I did pile paint into these depressions. It's not a good approach, but a thick layer of paint in details like these will help obscure layer lines. I need to find a better way of dealing with these details, so if you have any ideas, please let me know in the comments. For the dark blue, I used this paint, which I've actually had for a couple of years now. I bought this back when I was doing my first version of Baruka's Dagger back in 2020. I was going to use this for the hilt, but it ended up being too greenish, so I had to mix a different color. Still, I really like the color combination, and I've been waiting for a chance to use it. Afterwards, I did have to go back and touch this up several times. This is one of the reasons I really like using pre-mixed colors for this, as opposed to mixing my own, because it makes the minor touch-ups so much easier. I went through and added gold to the hilt. This is the same metallic folk art paint I use in all my projects. While I was at it, I started painting the spheres on the pommel. Eventually I finished the touch-ups and applied a spray-on matte sealer. This took a couple of passes with drying time in between to make sure everything got covered. And that was the project. It turned out pretty nicely, and it was satisfying to try out a few new things. All the files are posted on Thingiverse in case you want to make your own. I'll put a link in the description. After a couple of requests in the comments, I have gone and joined Twitter. I don't think I'm going to be too active on there, but I do plan to post some updates and maybe some pictures of smaller projects. There's a lot of little stuff I do which isn't worth making a video about, but I might show on Twitter. I'll post a link in the description if you're interested. If you enjoyed the project and want to support the channel, then please subscribe and like the video. I read and respond to pretty much every comment, so let me know what you think.